Just to get started, thank you for the introduction, Micheline. I really appreciate that. This is the first time that I'm speaking with BFO, and I'm really looking forward to it. And what my plan to talk about tonight was connection, grief, and resilience. And I wanted to talk about it as a clinical psychologist. I wanted to talk about it from a professional perspective, but I also have personal experiences that I wanted to share as well tonight and kind of give that personal touch to the presentation. So usually when I give a presentation or a talk, I like to thank the audience at the end. But tonight I really wanted to thank everybody for joining us right at the beginning for a couple of different reasons. One is if people do, as Micheline was saying, if you are feeling a bit overwhelmed, grief is very difficult. And sometimes we kind of have to dose it. And if you're feeling like maybe this is too much tonight, that's okay. And if you can't come back to the session, maybe you can come a different evening, maybe you can't finish the session, that's 100% okay. But I do want to thank you for being here. I'm honored to be here. And I think it really is showing strength in a challenging time for people to be here tonight. So again, and the other thing, and Micheline had mentioned this as well, is that sometimes we attend and we're not ready to talk, and that's 100% okay too. Sometimes just hearing things can be so helpful. So again, thank you for everyone for joining. Although I don't know you all yet, I assume that everybody here is here because they're going through some sort of loss. And I really can't emphasize enough how challenging going through grief and working through grief can be. And also just recognizing that everyone here is just doing the best that they can during these very difficult times. One of the things I wanted to have, and the reason it was in the title, and really I wanted to emphasize tonight, is the importance of connecting. So connecting is an interesting one for me because some of you have probably experienced this. Connecting is really, really important, but connecting with the right people is even more important. And it's really important to be able to find people that can be with you during these difficult times, that can be with you in your pain. And sometimes that's hard to do. And that's what this is so great to be able to find some of these connections. So even though I'm going to be doing a lot of the speaking tonight for this presentation part, it's not so much just about what I'm delivering and the message I'm delivering. It's more about the connections that you can open up. And you all have so many insights that you can offer. Everyone's experience is so different. So I'm hoping that tonight everybody is able to offer some help to others. So one of the things I decided would be important is to share a little bit about my own experience with grief before I move further into the presentation. So I've actually come to know grief quite well. I have a few significant experiences with grief. The photo that you see here is actually a photo of myself and my son. And unfortunately, my son has also come to know grief quite well from a young age. So in terms of my experiences, my first significant experience with a death was a close friend of mine. So there was my best friend throughout high school. We had kind of dated on and off all the way through high school. And then when I went off to university, we decided to kind of go different ways, but we still wanted to remain best friends. And so I came home from university. It was my first year, and I came home to visit, and I saw my best friend, and we went for a run, and we enjoyed some time together. And the following day, I got a call, and my friend had died by suicide. And I was 19 at the time, and it was such a difficult experience to work through, such a challenge to go through that. And you know, it's decades later now, and that still affects me. And that's something I'll be talking about today, is just that grief really is a process, and it's not so much a getting over, but the way that it affects us really changes as we work through our grief. A few years later, about 15 years later, several years later, actually, my mom was diagnosed with cancer. So I also had to go through losing my mom. My mom was given 3 years to live. She had terminal cancer, and unfortunately it took her a lot more quickly than the 3 years. It took her within about 1 year. And so I've had to go through the loss of a parent as well. And then sadly, this picture was actually taken about 7 years ago. And during this time, my husband at the time was quite ill and quite sick. And a couple years ago, it was shortly after the pandemic started, July of 2020, my son's father passed away as well. So not only have I gone through the loss of my best friend and the loss of my parent, but my son's father has also passed away. So between the two of us, we've experienced quite a lot of grief. One thing that I've realized with the different experiences that I've had is that my grief experience, each of those things that I went through, my experience was completely different. So not only as a person do you experience grief differently, but even depending on the person you lost and why you lost them, that can really change your experience with grief. My experiences have really taught me that obviously grief is so difficult and so challenging, and there's no straightforward way to get through grief. But there are definitely some things that we can do that can help, and there are some things that might not be as helpful, and that's what I want to share today. So again, thank you for being here. I'm so looking forward to being able to have this discussion with all of you. And I'm really hoping that this is a safe place for all of us to be able to share some of our stories and talk about our own experiences with grief. The next thing I wanted to do is talk about symptoms of grief. So this is not an exhaustive list. There are so many different symptoms that we can experience. I was talking with one of the facilitators, and I was wondering if this would be a good time for maybe people to share. But I think what would be better is, because I'm going to be saying these things, and you're probably going to be thinking, oh, she should have had this, and she should have had this, and there's going to be other things you experience that you want to share, and that would be great to do in the breakout rooms afterwards. So some of the things I have listed, often extreme sadness is sort of the number one thing most people will associate with grief. Also feeling lost. It's very normal to feel fatigue, to feel exhaustion, to feel burnout. We're often frustrated with uncertainty. There's often a lot of decisions to make, but we're having difficulty making those decisions. We have a lot of issues with solving problems. Anger is also a very common emotion to go through when we're working through grief. And sometimes it's anger, sometimes it's irritability. We also may catch ourselves lashing out at people. Sometimes we're even lashing out at people that are trying to be helpful. And again, just kind of reminding yourself that it's okay, that anger is part of it. Feeling resentful, feeling jealous, feeling envious. These are all common emotions. I know me from my personal experience. Certain holidays, certain events can be more challenging. So for me, Mother's Day is always a difficult one. And I always have that kind of envy when you see someone, on social media posting pictures with them and their mom or things like that. Those types of things. Sometimes seeing families, we have that jealousy or that envy. What I would encourage people to do is just to acknowledge the feeling, and don't get mad at yourself, because when you have the feeling and then you're mad at yourself for having the feeling, it just makes it 10 times worse. So just acknowledging it and knowing that it's okay to feel that way. It's quite typical to feel overwhelmed. There's just so many change. There's so much loss that you're dealing with. So feeling overwhelmed. You may expect to see your loved one. So this is one, again, particularly when my mother passed away. I remember going to my parents' house, and I would expect to hear my mom come down the stairs and to see her. And that's quite common. Sometimes too, we will actually think we saw or we see the person that passed. I had that experience as well with my best friend. I was writing an exam a few months after he had passed away, and there was someone that looked like him, and I thought it was him. And sometimes it just takes our brains a little while to adjust and to realize that they are really gone. Mm-hmm. Sometimes too, because of those experiences that we're having, we might feel like we're going crazy. And it's normal, and a lot of people describe grief as feeling like you're going crazy. It's hard. Some of these things that we are working through and going through are really difficult. We've never been through them before. Sometimes too, our emotions are all over the place, and all of these things are normal when we're working through grief. Another one I wanted to mention tonight, I know I've talked about connection already, but it's quite normal to feel alone. Your grief experience is so unique, and it's your own, and no one is going through exactly what you're going through, which can be a lonely experience. But this is why it's so important to talk to others, to share with others, to try and find the right people who can also take on some of your pain and talk about some of these really challenging things. And it will help you feel a little bit less alone. Another one that I had, and some of you may have had as well, is just that feeling like our world has stopped. We've lost the most important person or one of the most important people in our lives, and yet everything around us continues. And sometimes we kind of feel like things are pointless or feel a bit hopeless because of this experience. So as I said, There's many, many more. These are a few. And I would encourage people, even if you want to jot them down now or talk about note them to talk about in the breakout rooms, because I'm sure a lot of people have other ones that they would like to share. It's really normal to kind of have this feeling of, how do I do this? So I don't know how to exist in a world where my loved one doesn't. And that is 100% okay that you may feel that way. No one really knows how to do it, and you're not alone. But we also know that often it can feel that way. In terms of grief, I've mentioned this already, but your grief is unique. And so nobody knows exactly what you're going through. Nobody had the exact relationship that you had with your loved one. And so just reminding yourself that nobody can tell you exactly how to feel or what to feel, because your experience is unique. I like to think of grief not so much as a single emotion, but rather a state of mind for processing some of the loss that we're going through. I've also found in some of more the professional work and the research that I've done, it's actually helpful for me to think of grief as a natural process, or, and that it's actually useful, even though some of these things that we're going through might make us feel like we're going crazy. These are actually natural experiences to have. And a lot of what's going on, some of these things, I'll talk a little bit about the stages of grief, but things like denial, they're actually there to protect us, to kind of help dose some of the emotions that we're going through. It's also very common to feel like we've been robbed, or to just feel like the world's a horribly unfair place when we're working through some of these things. Another thing I wanted to mention is just the word grieve itself actually means to carry a heavy burden. And so, and I've seen a couple of you tonight, I've seen a few faces, and I think all of us tonight really are carrying a heavy burden, and it's important to sometimes lean on people a little bit and get some help in trying to carry that heavy burden. I didn't like hearing this, particularly when I was 19 and people told me grief was going to change me. I didn't want to change, and that's really common with grief. Grief is something that changes us, and we don't get to decide to do that. But grief really does change us. We also have to accept that the world we knew has changed. The world with our loved one has changed, and that can be really difficult to do. It's also quite common to come back to these same details or these same questions over and over and over again. And that's often our brain's way of trying to work through something that's really difficult to process. It is true that you won't always feel this bad. And, I think what happens initially, usually in the early stages, you have a lot more difficult days and a lot less good days. And slowly it will start to shift. And sometimes it starts just with the first time you laugh after your loved one passed away. And sometimes you'll laugh and then you'll feel guilty, or you might feel bad because you feel like you shouldn't be laughing when this person you love so much is gone. But those things are actually really important, and trying to have some of those moments of happiness and those moments of acceptance are going to be really important in the grief process. I'll say this a couple times tonight, but it's also really important to be patient with yourself. Grief isn't something that can be rushed or pushed or moved forward. And the other thing is that we don't actually get over someone, we don't get over grief. The grief actually, as I said before, it changes us, and it actually becomes a part of who we are. I wanted to touch briefly on the 5 stages. This presentation would have to be a lot longer to get into any sort of detail about the 5 stages, but the reason I wanted to talk about them briefly tonight is just there's a lot of misconceptions about the 5 stages and what they are. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross actually coined the 5 stages, and it was supposed to be about people who were terminally ill, so people who were dying, and that's where these stages came from. And it shifted, and it was often used more for people going through grief. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, along with Dr. Kessler, actually did write a book. There's a fantastic book called On Grief and Grieving, and it's all about the 5 stages. And what's really important is people often think that you start at the 1st stage and you get to the 5th stage and then you're done and it's over and you're ready to go back to your old life and move forward. And it doesn't work that way. It isn't linear. And it's really important for people to know that you're not just going to go through these stages. We actually want that. Sometimes we want to say like, okay, I want to be on stage 3 so that I know I'm going into stage 4 and then this is going to be over soon. but it really doesn't work that way. The stages, so I've listed the stages here. The 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So for a lot of us, we want to hit that 5th stage and accept it, as scary as that may be, because we think all of a sudden we're done. And I think it's really important just to remind yourself you're going to have these moments of acceptance, but then you might slide back into denial. And then you might be trying to bargain. Bargaining is when you're kind of saying, well, maybe if I'm a really good person, I'll wake up tomorrow and this will all be a dream. And those kinds of things are completely normal to experience. And just reminding yourself that really it's the reason that they came up with these 5 stages is to help us understand some of these things that we're going through. So this is a framework for identifying feelings, and it's really responses that people may have, but you also might not have all of them. And I know that was something I see a therapist with all the grief I've gone through. I've seen lots of different therapists throughout my life. And I remember following the loss of a loved one, thinking I needed to feel anger. I was supposed to feel anger. It was one of the stages. And I didn't have a lot of anger with that particular loss. So you may not actually experience all of these things. And I think that's important to know too. Okay. Moving through grief. So again, it's not so much about getting over grief, but just sort of moving through. And we don't get over the loss, but over time, what typically people will say is that the grief kind of softens. There's a book called Bearing the Unbearable. And one of the things they talk about in this book is that the intensity of the grief over time is going to start to decrease a little bit. And at the same time, your ability to manage grief, your ability to cope is going to go up. So we get better at managing the grief. And over time, that grief softens a little bit. So it becomes a little bit easier to deal with at the same time that we're getting better at managing it and coping with it. Another thing I wanted to mention, for a lot of us, we also have to confront a change in identity. So for example, if your partner passed away and they always did the cooking or they always did the finances, all of a sudden you may have to take on some of these things that you didn't do before. And that can be a challenge too. And sometimes you actually feel like you don't want to, because it's kind of admitting that they're gone. And so I think really kind of doing that slowly and trying to do that in your own time, if you can, or asking people for help are ways to kind of help you through that. Another thing, sometimes people will say to me, well, I don't want to heal because that means I'm going to forget the loved one. I can guarantee you none of you are going to forget your loved one. Your loved one is so important, and you're such an important part of your connection with them. So you're not going to forget them. But what we want to do is start to bring down the pain so you can have the love and the memories without so much of the pain. And that's really what we're working toward. So a couple of the things that don't tend to be as helpful, and I want to be careful here because I've said grief is unique and everyone grieves in their own way. But there are some things that might make it a little more challenging. So having inappropriate expectations can be harmful. That's when we might say, okay, I should be doing better than I am. Some of those should statements don't tend to be helpful because it's a unique journey and there is no guideline for where you're supposed to be. And so just trying to really work on allowing yourself to be where you are in the process and just accepting this is where I am and this is where I am today. And tomorrow might look really different. Yesterday might have looked really different, but this is where I am today. Another thing, sometimes people feel like you should be a little bit better every day. And so you might be feeling like, okay, Monday was a bit better, Tuesday was a little bit better, but now Wednesday was horrible and I've relapsed and everything is going terribly and I'm going in the wrong direction. That's not true. What happens is we usually go a couple steps forward and then we might go a step back. And sometimes too, we might go a couple steps back before we can go forward. And again, it's just kind of knowing over time, the pain will decrease and things will start to improve. But it's not every day will be better. I would suggest to people to try not to isolate with grief because it is such a unique experience. Sometimes we do want to isolate. Sometimes too, we might reach out to the wrong people. People say all sorts of interesting things when a loved one is lost, and some of those things aren't so helpful. And so just trying not to isolate, but also trying to choose people to connect with that are going to be understanding and non-judgmental will be important. The other piece I have there is just being careful with alcohol or drugs, some of these feelings that we're having are the strongest feelings we may have ever had in our lives. We may be experiencing more sadness than we ever knew was possible. And because the feelings are so intense, it's quite normal to want to numb those feelings a little bit. Alcohol and drugs will do that, but over time, those feelings are still going to be there. And numbing them is a short-term fix, but in the long term, it's actually going to cause more issues. A lot of people, when someone passes away, a lot of people carry secrets, and this can be really difficult. So we may have gotten in an argument with the person that passed away, or if it was addiction or suicide, we may have felt like there was something we did or something we said. I would encourage people to be careful about holding on to secrets, because often they create shame, and shame lives off of secrecy. Once we actually talk to someone about the secret, the shame starts to disappear. So we also have to be careful who we talk to about what that secret might be. So really making sure that it's someone that you trust, whether that be a friend or a family member, or possibly a counselor or a therapist. But once you release that secret, you will feel quite a bit better. And sometimes you need to do that slowly. Comparative suffering is another one. So this is when we say, oh, well, what happened to me is really bad, but I just heard someone else's story and it's way worse than what happened to me. That doesn't tend to be helpful. Your grief is unique. Your experience is unique. And I think it's really important that you give your own grief the attention that it deserves. Also working on trying not to criticize our feelings too much. I think we all do this from time to time. So we might say, I'm angry and I shouldn't be, or I feel guilty and I shouldn't, or things like that. But just kind of acknowledge your feelings, be aware of them. Say, you know what, I am feeling really angry today. I may or may not know why, but I am feeling really angry. And the last one I have there is just giving weight to comments that aren't very helpful. So a lot of you probably, and this might be something you want to talk about in the breakout rooms, but a lot of you have probably had people say things that really aren't helpful and often are hurtful. I know for me, when my best friend passed away, at one of the wakes, I was standing with the family, and I introduced, as people were coming up, I introduced myself as Phil's best friend. And there was a woman that came up, an older woman, and she took my hand, and I thought she was going to say something really comforting and really kind. And clearly I was in shock still at this point. And she grabbed my hand and she looked at my eyes and she said, "How did you not know?" And I remember at that time feeling so hurt by a comment like that. And some of those comments, they're not meant to be, usually they're not meant to be hurtful and harmful, but they can be. So just being careful about holding on to some of those things that, maybe we're coming from the wrong perspective and that person maybe just doesn't quite understand what you're going through. So on to things that help. So it's really important that you feel the pain. You have the right to hurt. It's really important that we release our pain by expressing it and trying to find ways that are healthy to express that pain. Wolf Felt is another very well-known researcher in grief, and he talks about just kind of sometimes dosing your pain. Sometimes it's too much to just let it all go, particularly in when something has just happened and you're in the first few days and weeks. You'll have no ability to dose, but over time, maybe it's a year or 2 years later or even further, you might still want to put some time aside where you can actually dose your pain. You can have a time where you just spend, maybe each day where you just spend thinking about your lost one. Connections, I've talked about this many times, but again, finding people who listen without judgment, sharing your pain, it's not going to make it go away. That's not our goal. That's not what we're working towards. But over time, it does become more bearable. All of us right now, all of us who are going through a loss, we're vulnerable because we are going through a loss and we're going through something really difficult and really challenging. And it's so important to do your best to try and be gentle with yourself. I want to mention grief bursts or grief attacks. Some of you may have experienced these. I had this happen and I didn't know what it was when it happened, but I mentioned earlier a few of the losses that I had. I also had a cousin pass away. She was, I believe, 23 or 24, and she was struck by a truck downtown in Ottawa. And I went to her funeral. I come from a very big family. My dad was one of 12 kids, and they all had a lot of kids. And we were walking into the funeral as a family, the whole herd of us, and they were playing bagpipes. And as soon as the bagpipes started to play, so here I was, it was a funeral, it was someone very young, it was very tragic, and I heard the bagpipes and my legs just gave out and I started wailing. And I'm typically, my family knows me as somebody that doesn't always express the emotions as well as I should. And I usually hold some of those things in, but it hit me so hard. And I remember talking to a friend who was a psychologist, and I said, it felt like a panic attack, but it was sadness. And what I've come to learn is that was a grief burst. So it just hit me. And my friend who had passed away, my best friend, there was bagpipes at his funeral. And so this was probably about 12 years later, and it hit me kind of out of the blue. They're okay. They don't kill you, but they really do affect you. It's a very strong emotion that you may feel. And just recognize that, again, this is part of the grief process, and it's okay if these things happen. So what do we do with the grief? How do we move forward? So we've talked about recognizing the losses. I briefly wanted to mention not only that you have lost your person, but there's a lot of other losses. You've lost a future with that person, right? And so thinking about, what you were going to do, what your plans were in the future, thinking, when there's big milestones and that person's no longer going to be there. Sometimes too, I know for me, I was quite religious when I was younger, and I was brought up Catholic. And when my best friend died by suicide, I really had a crisis of faith. And so sometimes we have that kind of loss of faith or questioning the world, even our belief system, that might be, if I'm a good person, good things will happen. And so just kind of realizing there's a lot of losses that are all connected when we're grieving. Trying to be with the pain is important, trying to accept it and not judge it. Trying to accept all the feelings. Our feelings are just our feelings. And they're actually driven by a very primitive part of our brain. And it's not a very logical part of our brain. And so sometimes the feelings don't make a whole lot of sense, but just the more we accept them, the better it is for us. Also, I mentioned earlier, it's okay and actually quite normal to feel angry at times. What we have to be careful with is, what do we do with that anger? So if we go out and smash someone's car, well, obviously that's not a very good reaction to the anger. So trying to figure out, and sometimes this is a learning process, how do you channel it? Does exercise help? Does drawing help? Does journaling help? Does singing help? Does screaming into a pillow help? Trying to find what is going to be helpful for you. Another thing I just wanted to mention briefly is sometimes anger can also be a way of avoiding some of our more vulnerable feelings, like feelings of sadness. I would encourage people to count their wins. So sometimes we think our wins have to be these really big things, especially in the early stages. A win it could be getting out of bed. It could be having something to eat that day. It could be reaching out to a friend. Any win that you're making, I want you to count. I'm trying to remind yourself you aren't alone, even though it may feel like that sometimes. And also that healing occurs in phases. And I mentioned earlier, we can expect those relapses. So sometimes we'll be surprised and we'll kind of fall back a little bit. It doesn't mean you're going backwards. That's just part of the grieving process. Tips for coping. So I work with a lot of clients who deal with stress and anxiety and depression. And one thing that I've really come to realize with any sort of coping skills or coping tools, it's really important that they reflect your personality. So if you've never done yoga in your life and you think it's the most ridiculous thing ever, and I tell you to do yoga, it's not going to be helpful at all. So trying to figure out what are some ways that you can cope that actually reflect your personality and who you are. I talk about anchors with a lot of the clients that I see. So sleep, eating, and exercise are what I call the anchors. The reason I call them anchors is that we have a certain amount of control over those things. Sleep is a tough one. All of these are tough when we're going through loss. Often our sleep can be very difficult because of dreams and difficulty falling asleep and all sorts of other reasons. But even just trying to get yourself to bed, trying to be in bed at regular sleep times is important. Eating, again, you might not feel hungry, or you might be eating excessive amounts, but just trying to regulate your eating a bit, even asking friends if they could bring meals. or people just to check in and make sure you've eaten can be a good idea. Exercise is just good for our physical and our mental health. So exercise might just be stretching or getting out for a walk. Journaling can be really helpful. I started a journal when my mom was diagnosed with cancer, and I've continued that journal. I just do it on my laptop, and it's hundreds of pages long now. But it's really been fascinating to me because I can go back and I can look at where I was in the grieving process many years ago compared to now, and it's just fascinating to be able to see that. Journaling, if writing's not your thing, if typing's not your thing, a lot of the people I work with also like to record, and they'll do voice recordings of where they are, and that's another option, and that can just be a way of processing how you're feeling. Trying to be with people, again, obviously the connections are important. Giving yourself permission to feel rotten. You're gonna have some bad days, you're gonna have some awful days, you're gonna have some of your worst days ever, but also allowing yourself to have those happy moments that I talked about, to laugh, to enjoy things. Dealing with the problems of today, so really trying to think about one day at a time. Sometimes it's too overwhelming to think further at more than one day ahead. I know for me, with a couple of the losses that I had, I couldn't even think about one day. For me, there was a period of time where I just said, I'm going to get through the next 5 minutes. And I know I can get through the next 5 minutes, and I'm going to start there. And so even starting with that and saying, how am I going to get through the next 5 minutes? What am I going to do? Might be where you're at right now. Finding help, obviously talking to family, friends, coworkers, these types of grief groups, therapists, all of those things are important in the grief process. A few more tips for healing. So I mentioned earlier, our emotions are actually driven by the primitive part of our brain. It's the back of our brain. If we try and logic our way out of, maybe if we're feeling really angry or really scared or really emotional, if we try and use logic and talk our way out of it, it's not usually very effective. But taking a few deep breaths is actually a way that we can communicate with the back of our brain. So just a deep breath in, a deep breath out. And I've kind of done this, this just becomes part of my day now. When I'm waiting on something, if I'm waiting in line, if I'm stuck in traffic, any of those kinds of things, just take a couple of deep breaths in and deep breaths out. And it's so simple, but it can be so helpful. Trying to focus on what we can control versus what we can't is important. Resisting that urge to seek approval from others. I mean, we're driven as humans to want to do that, but it typically isn't very helpful. Trying to let go of some of those expectations. So feeling the feelings of what should be and just really trying to focus in on what is. It's important to stop comparing, whether it be your grief or your life or other things. Try to stop comparing to others and just really work on trying to focus on your path and where you're going and where you want to go. And I mentioned this earlier as well, but choosing friends who will support you and encourage you, and friends that are non-judgmental, is going to be important. Some of you may have heard this analogy before. A lot of the parenting work, we talk about this analogy, and I think it's so important when you're going through an experience of grief as well. The analogy is, it's basically what's said when you get on an airplane, when the flight attendant will say, before you help anyone else with their oxygen mask, you have to put your own oxygen mask on first. And the reason for that is, if you're struggling and trying to get someone else's on and you don't have your own on, you're not going to help them and you're not going to help yourself. And so, especially for me, as you know, as a lone parent, it's really hard. And I've heard that before, where people say, well, I just don't have time to take care of myself. But I've really realized in my experience that I have to take care of myself in order to take care of my son, in order to take care of my family members, my friends, my clients, all of that. So and I think in some ways too, it takes away some of the guilt. Sometimes we feel guilty to take care of ourselves, but it takes away some of that when we realize it's not just for me, it's for others as well. So making sure that we take care of ourselves so we can take care of those around us. I'm almost done. I hope I'm okay with the timeline, but I wanted to share one more personal story with you before I wrap things up. And this story is about my mom as well. So about a week before my mom passed away, she was in the hospital and she didn't know how to use social media very well. So we're not sure how she did this, but she posted a quote on Facebook, and the quotes has become really important to myself and my sisters. I have 4 siblings, and 2 of them are sisters, and we've actually used this quote. We found different places where it is, and we have different tokens and stuff. And the quote has become really meaningful and a way of kind of connecting us to our mom. So the quote is, promise me you'll always remember you're braver than you believe and stronger than you seem and smarter than you think. And I love this quote. It's from Winnie the Pooh. And it actually has given me a lot of strength. And so not everyone has a quote from their lost one that they can use, but I think it's a good idea to try and see, is there a quote? Is there some sort of, are there words that might give you a little bit of strength? Um, and sometimes those are words that might be a close connection with your loved one, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's more about moving forward and how you're going to move forward. Sometimes too, it can just be something simple where you say to yourself, you put your hand on your heart and you say, this is really hard. And you might even pretend it's your loved one saying that to you, this is really hard. But just trying to find, what are those words that can help you, and just something small to remind yourself when you're struggling, just to help you a little bit through some of those days. So again, I'm all done. So thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Thank you all for being here. I'm really, again, honored to be a part of the grief journey for all of you. I know there's a lot of information in the presentation I gave, so don't think you're going to have to know all of the different things I covered. But even if one or two things stood out and you take that from tonight, in my mind, that would be a great thing. So thank you. Thank you for the facilitators as well at BFO. And thank you for everybody that listened in tonight.